So today we're going to talk about intents. We're going to go a little bit more over Android Studio, talk a little bit more in depth about that, a little bit about debugging your app if something goes wrong, that sort of thing. So I'm going to skip over this because I'm actually going to start a fresh project. So we'll talk about activities and layouts when I start that fresh project. So we'll create a new project for intents, which we'll talk about right now. And so I'll skip over this section right now. All right, so intents. What is an intent? So this is the kind of like my definition. I think I have another slide with the official definition, which is a little bit more dry. But intents are objects that can launch additional activities. So what's an activity? Just to remind you, an activity is a place or a little tiny mini application we can think of that has its own life cycle, gets created, gets destroyed, that contains UI elements and logic behind that. So we have the controller code that is contained in the activity, and the activity is responsible for going out, loading a particular layout XML file, bringing that in, what's called inflating it, and then putting that on the screen for us. So that's what an activity is. But if we want to have multiple activities or have an activity launch another activity, then this is what we use to do that. It's called an intent. In other application frameworks, you might be more used to creating a new instance of an activity class and then setting it up and then calling like .run on it or adding it to some stack. This is kind of how this is going to do this, but the Android operating system is going to handle a lot of this for us. And we'll show you what that looks like in a second to make that a little bit more clear. But once created, let's see, so create. Okay, so the intents also allow you to not only just load up the activity, but also pass in data. So maybe I want to send the activity some new information. If I am clicking on a pin on a map that is going to show me a details view, maybe I pass what location or what building or what, whatever that pin represented, I pass a little bit of information onto that details activity so that that details activity can go and fetch the class or the information in order to display it. And then likewise, for passing information back to the parent activity, you can also use intents to pass data back and forth. So once these are created, use a new intent to return data back, which is what I just said. So that's there. And then from the documentation, an intent is an abstract description, of an operation to be performed. So this is a little bit more broader of a definition, and we'll go into why that is in a second. But it can be started with start activity to launch an android.app.activity. That's just the full package name for activity. That's just the class. A broadcast intent we can also use to send any interested broadcast receivers. And so this has other uses besides just launching activities. And then also for services, so start service, context, bind service, that sort of thing. So we can also communicate between services, which are essentially just background processes that run. So that's why I gave you kind of my definition, and then this is from the docs. And we'll talk a little bit more about intents later on in the class when we do talk about broadcast receivers and services. But for right now, just think of it as a way to launch other activities within your app. And if you remember from last class, we created a new activity, but we didn't actually launch it because we didn't talk about intents yet. So here's a nice little diagram, and so you can see that on the left-hand side is a little quiz that we'll create today. We have a true/false button, a cheat button, and a next button. So pressing any one of those buttons creates a new activity, which is that middle diagram there, that will, you press the cheat button, I should say, and then this little activity comes up and it says show answer, and it has some information on it. And so when you press that cheat button, what the app does in the background is pass a little bit of information about what question it is, so that when it launches this new activity on top, which is that middle section, that it knows which question you're trying to cheat on and maybe gives you a little hint. And then if you hit answer, it knows what the answer is to that question. And then if you hit the back button, which is a button on the lower part of the device, it's a hardware button usually. Well, no, sorry, I take that back. It's now software. It depends on your device, of course, but if you hit the back button, then that kills the top activity and returns you back to the parent activity is what I like to call it sometimes. But so that's those little arrows there, the press cheat button, use that that's basically our intent, and that kind of little highway of information is our intent. We can pass information to that secondary activity, and then when you hit the back button, you can also do the same thing. Is you can use an intent, say that arrow to represent it, to say, okay, well, he or she either told me to show the answer or not, and that way you know whether they cheated and that sort of information. The parent activity knows what happened in that child activity. And so this is a interaction diagram, a little bit of UML before we throw this at you. This is, on the left-hand side, we have our quiz activity. This is our parent activity. And the user presses the cheat button, which is what we had in the example before. On click, so we implemented the on click list in our last class. We call this method called start activity for result. This is kind of the thing that we use to launch our activity. And we give it an intent, and so we have this intent object here, and it has a little bit of extra information. That extra answer is true, and it gives it the component, which is which activity to actually launch. So this component is the class cheat activity, so this is the child activity. So we bundle all this up into an intent object, and then this goes off to the Android operating system, and there's an activity manager that handles all this for us, and it handles the pushing onto the stack and the popping off of the stack, but you never have to worry about that. So once you call start activity for result, it goes off, does its thing, it comes back, and it launches your cheat activity. So you have a cheat activity class. That class then has an onCreate method and everything else that we talked about as your parent activity did. Same idea. But then when you're done, what you can do is you can call setResult and then pass it another intent, and then which is this guy here. So we package another intent. We give it some information. In this case, an extra answer shown, which is just the key that they're using. And then again, that goes back off to the Android operating system, to the activity manager, and that handles all the processing. It gets, the freeing of the memory, the popping off the stack of activities that we have. And then back in your parent class, we have well, this is on activity result, but as parameters, we get these 3 parameters. 1 is the request code, 2 is the result code, and 3rd is the intent. So we can actually say what the result code was, kind of like a server-side response, like a 400 or a 200 or a 301, that sort of thing, is the result code. And then the intent, any information that you wanted to bundle into that intent to pass back. In this case, they're sending back a extra answer shown. And this follows the same pattern that we mentioned with our bundle that we create when we're rotating our view and recreating our view. So same idea, it's just that put extra call. And so this diagram's for your reference, but it's kind of ugly and just, it's a little bit more verbose than it really needs to be. So let's jump into a little bit of code here. So to create an activity, the first one is probably the activity that we'll use, I don't know, most of the time I'll say. I don't want to say all the time, because there are definitely instances where we'll use the bottom one, but an explicit intent. This is an intent that we are explicitly defining. We're saying intent, and I'm just calling this second activity intent. You can call this child activity, you can call this whatever makes sense for you in your code. And then we're creating a new instance of the class intent, and then we do something kind of interesting. This is our main activity, the root activity, if you will. We're doing a .this, and what that does, if you're not familiar with this, is it actually passes back a reference to the class itself, not any instance of it, but basically the definition of it, so that this intent class can create that class. It can call new on it, and this way we can pass in almost any activity subclass that we want. So we can pass in a main activity, we can pass in a child activity, or any of the activities that you have defined in your application. And then the second one is, I'm sorry, I got that backwards. So main activity is the actual parent activity that's calling it, and then this is what I was talking about. Second activity .class is the class definition for creating that secondary activity. So the first one's called what's called a context. So when this intent goes off and creates the second activity class, it calls new. It basically calls like this. It says new and then second activity class, or second activity in this case, and creates an instance. But when it creates that instance of the second activity class, it passes in a reference to the parent, in this case main activity. And so there are in our second activity, we have a way of going back, or actually Android Studio, or excuse me, Android OS has a way of knowing who the parent of that activity is. You don't have to pass back the parent activity. It can be either root one way up there. There's a couple of different instances, but that's the context of it. And then finally, after you create an instance of this intent, calling it second activity intent, we pass that into a start activity. This is part of the activity class. This is a method of the activity class. So that's why it's just kind of out there. It's kind of just, there's no definition for it, but it is part of the activity class. So
why do you need the main activity, not this?
Again, that's the context of the parent. So you're passing a reference to the child who the parent is. And so when you, this is for, they use this for all sorts of things, but when you create like a little message that pops up, it has to do that on the root element, or at least in the hierarchy of views, it kind of has to say who's the hierarchy or who's the parent of everybody, so that it can display that view over top of all the children, things like that. So you give it a context. So if you see the definition of what the intent class constructor looks like, that first parameter actually says context. And so I'll show you that in code, but that's why, yeah. And it doesn't always have to be the class that you're calling this in, but most of the time it is. And then finally we have an implicit intent. And so this is, we'll get to this, but when you're launching the camera, for example, that's a second activity that technically is the second activity that you're launching that goes on top of your parent activity. But you don't set it up this way. You have a single constant that you give to it, and then it goes off and figures out what you need. There's no class that you assign to it, because the camera, for example, is dependent on the device you have. Some devices only have one camera, some have two. Others may have, I don't know, 10. And so by kind of being a little bit more implicit about it, you let the operating system figure those out. And so here's some examples. When you launch a map, a web browser, an email, so you want to send an email from your application, you can actually open up the email app, send it some information like who you're sending it to, the subject, the body, that sort of thing. You don't say, here, take this class, this email class dot this. You don't have to instantiate anything. You just pass it a constant instead, and the Android operating system goes off. So those are the differences between explicit and implicit. You really don't need to know the difference between the two, because as you use it, you'll see kind of how to launch a camera, how to do this, how to create your own custom activities, launch your own custom activities. Yes, Bob?
Does iOS, the Apple, I'm not familiar with it. Jake was saying that they can't, one activity can't open up another one.
In iOS? So it works differently. It's more, in iOS it's a little bit more unified, but it's more probably what you're used to, where you have one class, that class creates an instance of another class, and then you have a direct reference to it. Android doesn't do that. You don't create an instance of that second activity class directly. You never call new on that second activity class. And so we use intents to talk between the two activities. And that's actually, it has a lot to do with the history of Android, because Android, I think, dates back to like 2001 when the code base is. So a lot of this stuff was done for reasons that no longer really exist anymore. And when we get to fragments, we'll talk a little bit more.
To have an application that, like an Apple application for my kid's iPad, that has a timer that then ties into the lock screen app. So then after an hour, I can program. You have an hour, and then it's going to lock. I haven't found an application out there that does that.
For iOS?
For like my kids, that's Apple for their iPad. because
Yeah,
I'm
so
going to bed
Apple,
in 30 minutes.
for your iOS app, this is good to know, your app lives in what they call a sandbox. And basically you can't go outside your sandbox. And your sandbox exists within this very small confine of the operating system. So they allow you to have access to almost anything you need, like camera, GPS, that sort of thing. But you have to go make an operating system call. You say, go and grab me an instance of the camera, and it'll pass you back an instance of the camera, and you can start using that. Whereas with Android, you essentially have full control over the operating system to an extent, but that's essentially the differences between them. Is in iOS, you're very, very isolated, which makes it super secure, but very less flexible. Android, you can have a lock screen, you can have a custom lock screen, you can do widgets on the home page. You can turn off and on the Bluetooth, whereas Apple iOS you can't. You can't programmatically turn off Bluetooth, for example. You can't turn off the Wi-Fi. But on Android devices, you pretty much have full control over all that stuff. They don't really restrict you too much, though I think they're kind of closing it down as all this malware stuff comes out for Android. Whereas Apple, because of their tight security and their tight control over developers and what APIs you're allowed to use, they are a lot more secure. So it's a trade-off. If you want to be free and insecure, Android's the solution. If you don't want to worry about that kind of thing, but you don't mind the less flexible programs that are on it, then iOS is the choice for you. So it depends. It's a nice trade-off. Like, choice is great, right? So you can decide for yourself which one you want. All right. So let me just see. Okay. So let's just do this really quickly. So I am going to, in Android Studio, I'm going to create a new project. So go to File, New Project. And this is going to be called O2 Intense. And we are going to put that in, looks like I already put it in my example code, so that's perfect. Except for it does not like, the first digit to be a number, that's right. I always have this problem. But I do want it to be called O2 Intense in the folder. Alright, and so we're just going to call this project Intense. It's going to go in an example code, so I'll push that up to the repository so you can have it up there. We're just going to accept the defaults here. And a blank activity is fine. Yes, okay, blank activity. So actually, some of you might have seen you have a main content, or you have a main layout and you have a content layout. And in the video that I put together, that's the way that I demo it, but I think for the example code, it was just one layout file. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry. If you were having that issue, then we'll see what I mean here. So activity details and main activity here in these two files. So this is creating a new project for us, and this will take a second. All right, so this is that file that I was talking about. It's this pop-up. So I want to do add root. That's all I want to do. Yep, it just fixes itself. I don't know how to do that manually. I always click that when it comes up. And so right now this is indexing it. And if I hit Command 1, I can see my files. If your file explorer doesn't pop up on the left-hand side there, just hit Command 1 or Control 1. That just means you're not in a Git repository, which is a problem only if you're working on a project. I mean, if you're working on a project and it's outside a Git repository, then yeah, you need to add it to a Git repository so you can save your work and everything. That's a good question. That probably means you don't have Git installed, but if you have SourceTree, you have Git. So I wouldn't worry about it. Just do it through SourceTree. Yeah, so Android Studio right now is trying to control your Git repository. It's trying to version your files, but you don't have to do it through Android Studio. You can do it through SourceTree. Yeah, for this example, it's not that important, but obviously it is important when you submit your project. Okay, so what I was talking about before is you have two layout files here. You have your activity main, and then you have a content main. with the latest SDK, they want you to put everything in the content main, and the activity main is kind of just a wrapper that then includes the content main. So if we look at activity main, and we go to the file for it, or the code for it, you can, where is it? Here, include content main. Okay, so what this line of code is doing is just saying, for content main.xml, we're just going to take the contents of that file and stick it right there. And so there might be a little bit of confusion of which file to edit, but it is that content main file. So for this project, we're going to leave the activity main XML file alone. We're going to go content main and hit design to switch over back to our design view. Another thing, just want to make sure. Okay, so when I select these, I don't know why this doesn't save my preferences sometimes. When I select these two different files, you can see the source or the details on the right-hand side of the screen are not changing. So if I click on activity main, it's the activity main. If I click on content main, nothing changes. And this is because, for example, if I wanted to go up to my code file, maybe I want to switch to my code file, I could double-click on it and it'll open it. But what I really like to do, because I'm lazy and I don't want to click more than once, so I can go up to this gear, this settings here, and go to auto scroll to source. So when I click on it, it'll scroll to the source. And then if I have tabs at the top, I can auto scroll from source. So as I select the source, it'll select the item on the left-hand side, or vice versa. I forget which one actually does which. But selecting those two options in this little gear, auto scroll to source and auto scroll from source, will give me the ability to single click on activity main and switch to it. And it might not seem like a big deal, but as you have, again, tabs at the top and you're switching between tabs, it'll highlight the file on the left-hand side as well. So just a little tip. I think I showed you that last time, but again, I don't know why this doesn't save my preferences, because I always have to set that up. But anyway, so we're going to just kind of go through the steps for the project one kind of as a review, which is why I skipped over that first slide. But we're going to say so which class is the best? Okay, we don't have to give it an ID, and the reason why we don't have to give it an ID is because we're never going to refer to this text field in code. If you wanted to make it dynamic, be it from a database or from a REST API or some kind of dynamic data store, and we wanted to change this text dynamically, then yes, we would need an ID to get a reference to it and then change the text so that as we go through the questions, this text changes. But for example, this is just going to be a one-question quiz, so I'm not going to fill in the ID. And then I am going to drag in some buttons. So CS402 is going to be the text, and I'm going to call this CS402. I believe we can put numbers in our IDs. And then I'm going to drag in another button. And the layout right now is not going to really matter. We're not setting this up in any particular scalable fashion. So if I rotated this, it would probably look horrible, but that's okay. We'll talk about that later. And then CS517, which is the other section of this class. And I'm going to say CS517, capital B for button. Okay, so we have those set up. Now we switch over to our main activity, and underneath inside of our onCreate, which is our entry point. Again, this is when the activity is first created. And because it's first created and it's not on the screen, we actually don't want to set any code. We don't want to set any UI elements here. We don't want to say set the text to this or set the text to that usually, because it won't come up on the screen because the button doesn't exist yet. So let's see, what was I going to do? So I have two references to buttons. I have a button called CS402, and this is asking me for the button, so I just hit Option Enter. and it automatically imports that. So 402 button equals, and I know this is a button, so I'm going to typecast it as a button, find view by ID, and we pass in the ID that we named when we double-clicked on the UI element, r.id.cs402. And again, I like to name my variables similar. So if I have multiple items on the screen, I like to name the first part of those variables the same so that I can type that in and have autocomplete just show me those items. So it's not, I don't have to see whether I named it, you know, something with a T or something with an A or something with a Z and have to scroll through my autocomplete. So we'll do that, enter, and let's get rid of my source on the right. So to get rid of the menu on the left-hand side, you can hit Command 1 or Control 1. So I have a full view, and this is awesome. I forgot all about presentation mode, but so CS517 as our second button, we do the same exact thing. So we do button, typecast it, because what find view by ID passes back is a class instance of view, and we want to make sure that that gets typecast down to a button. And then so r.id and CS517. Okay, so now we have a reference to both of our buttons. We're going to do a click listener on our first button, CS402 button dot set on click listener. And so again, this is going to give us the ability to add in some logic here for when this button is tapped. And so when this button is tapped, the operating system asks us, hey, what do you have set as your click listener? So let's give it a click listener to execute on. So new on click listener. Wait a second, and it'll auto-populate all that code that I can never remember off the top of my head, so I love Android Studio. And in the on-click method here, we want to say, okay, well, we want this to launch a new activity to say whether you were right or wrong. I mean, this is probably not a very good UI choice. Maybe we want to pop up a dialog because that probably makes a little bit more sense, or pop up a little toast menu, which is kind of like a little black bar that has some text in it that kind of pops up and disappears if you've ever seen that. But for our purposes, we're just going to launch a new activity, or a new activity, but we don't have that activity yet. So hitting Command 1 again, we can open up our files here on the left-hand side, and I'm going to right-click on my package. For this app, since we called it Intense, we have our Java package name. Just right-click on that and go to New in the menu that pops up. Go down to Activity, and for some reason that put the I don't know if you guys can see this. This is the menu that I want, but it's behind that menu. I don't know. Either that's a Mac thing or a maybe it's in the presentation mode that I'm in. Okay, so New Activity. Oh boy. Okay. Hopefully you guys aren't seeing this, but I'm just going to arrow down to blank activity. So pretty much the same thing as we started out with in our first activity. Give it a name. I'm going to call this, I always like to call these details views because these are, you know, details of the activity, or they're called activities because you're performing activities, right? But this is the class activity. Yep, put it in the package there. We don't want to use fragments. Okay, everything looks good. So this is kind of where we ended last class, so hopefully that was a good review for you. Now, because I've added my project to Git, you might not see this if you haven't, so don't worry about it if you don't see this particular view, but Git or Android Studio is asking me, okay, you've added files, do you want to go ahead and stage those? And yeah, sure, I'll go ahead and stage those so that when I go into Git, they'll already be in there and I can track changes and everything. If you hit cancel or no, you could always do that later, so don't worry about it. Okay, so now this is our details activity. We can go back to our main activity, or our content main. And so as I switch back and forth between these, you can see here are the two buttons, and then this is my content details. And for this one, I am just going to put in a text field. Let's do a large text field this time. We're going to center it, and so you are correct, you're right, you know, that sort of thing. And that's all we're going to do. You can, you know, your imagination can run wild in these things, but we're going to keep it simple. And we're going to go back to our main activity. And so this is now asking me, do I want to add this configuration, blah, 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 to Git? Yeah, sure, why not? I could always add it later. Okay, so now that we have created a new class called details activity, and that has an accompanying layout file and everything that we can edit for our UI, I can now instantiate that. But again, we don't call, you might be tempted in other frameworks to do something like details activity, and so it comes up automatically. It's not imported yet, but if you click on this, it'll auto import. Don't do this, by the way. I'm showing the wrong way. New details activity, something like that. And you're most certainly welcome to do that. Android Studio or Android OS SDK will allow you to do this, but it becomes useless because you can't do anything with this. Well, that's not exactly true. Maybe you want to call some methods in this class or something like that. So it's not entirely useless, but I've never done it this way. And maybe there's instances where you do, but you don't want to do this because there's no way to pass directly an instance of an activity to the activity manager, which is owned by the operating system, in order to launch or put this on the screen. So I'm dead in the water at this point. So we don't do it this way. Instead, what we do is we create an intent, and I'm just going to call it intent. And it's asking me, okay, well, I don't know what an intent is, so option enter will auto import that. And this is where we do new intent. And then we pass it, let's see, I can never read these documentations here, but there's a couple things in here. The one I want, I do believe, is this one, I think. I don't know, I'm just going to type it in. So, so we're coming in from the main activity, .this. I do believe you can just type in this, but it'll be more explicit when I say this. And then for the activity that we actually want to, okay, yeah, it was this one. That's why I can never read the context here. So I don't know if you can see this in the back. It's very cryptic. Context, package context, class, and then I guess it's a template. So that's what that is. But I always get confused, so I just type it in. So what this is looking for is the context. So the context is our main activity, as we explained before, and then the class that we want to create. So instead of doing the details activity equals new details activity, this whole line essentially boils down, when we create our intent, to details activity dot class. Okay, so the intent, or more exact, the activity manager will take this class definition and then use it to instantiate its own version of this line here. Let me expand this so you can see all the lines here. So again, that highlighted line is what is going to be declared somewhere off in the Android operating system world. We don't really care. We don't want to have to manage this at all, so I'm going to delete that. But I just wanted to be explicit about that because that's what it's doing under the hood. Okay, that's what this is doing. We're just passing it a reference to the class itself so that it can instantiate it. Okay, and then what we can do on this one is, let's see if this works. Start. No, is it a class? Just trying to show you where this comes from. Activity dot. Oh, okay. So for this one, it's asking either just for an intent or an intent and bundle options. And you can give it bundle options if and only if you want to pass information to the secondary activity. So all we have to do is just pass it the intent. And that should just work. Let me copy this. Oops. Did I copy it? Let's make sure I copy it. Copy and paste. And rename this CS402. And it's going to launch the same exact activity. So because we haven't changed anything, so it's going to do the exact same thing, which is okay. I'm going to hit Control R, and let's see, I do not have a device running. So let me run, I will show you how to set up Genymotion. I'll probably do a short video on that. I prefer Genymotion over the AVD stuff. And yeah, that one's fine, I guess. It's a lot easier to launch. Just want to make sure that's still streaming. So if you've ever used the AVDs, that little Android startup screen takes like a minute, 3 minutes, 10 minutes sometimes. It's pretty obnoxious, but and Genymotion, much faster. Okay, so now that we have that running, we can switch back to our code, and now we can see that this is now running, so I'm just going to hit OK. But I don't want this to keep asking me every time I compile my code which device to use. So I'm going to check this box at the bottom left-hand corner that says use same device for future launches. Yes, please. And give it a second to compile. And I'm going to switch over to Genymotion to see. Okay, so session launched. All right, great. So this is actually in landscape, as you can see, and it kind of looks a little funny because we didn't set up the proper layout, but that's okay. So if we hit CS402, which class is the best, it launches that activity. So you kind of saw it come in. It didn't come in from the side. It didn't do anything like that. It kind of appeared almost from a very far distance, but it came kind of zooming in on you. So it says, you're right, great. So the back button that I was talking about in the notes is this little button down here in the bottom left-hand corner in the black bar. I don't know if you can see that in the back. If you're used to Android, you probably know where this is. Sometimes this is a hardware button. Sometimes it's actually on the screen itself, depending upon the device. But I think most of the time they're doing it as a software button now. But it doesn't matter. Just hit the back button, and you can see that it goes back to our parent activity. And then if I do CS517, it launches that same activity because, yeah, both classes are the best, right? So that works as intended. And we hit the back button, and again. So this is a nice way of showing a different interface based on a interaction by the user. Okay. Any questions on that?
What are the triangles with the...
Yeah, that's a good question. So if you're not familiar with Android, the middle button is the home button. So if I hit home, that'll go back to my home screen. Oh.
Yeah, it looks like they're...
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. This is just a bunch of stuff that I... It's a real Android device. So yeah, there's a Facebook friend up there, my BSU email stuff coming in, because I set this up for other things like Facebook interactions and that sort of thing. So if you want your apps to tie into Facebook, Genymotion, and to a certain extent the AVDs can do all this stuff. So it's essentially like an Android device running on your computer. So yeah, sorry, noticed that. But just to continue, in case you guys were wondering, the home button and then the switch app, the quick switch apps, if you have multiple apps running, it's the home button. And then go back to that app, that sort of thing. So those buttons actually look different in different Android operating systems. So if you're coming from, I think Ice Cream Sandwich was different. Question in the back.
So is the your right activity being destroyed or just hidden?
So yes, that's a great question. So this activity, this parent activity, let's call it, is not being destroyed in this particular case. But I did mention that if you go into settings, so I'm going to go into my apps here, and I got a bunch of apps in here, settings. So if you can see this here, it's the bottom right hand corner, the settings option, and then I scroll down. I already have this enabled. But if you click on about, yeah, the tablet, and is it build number? Okay, there it is. So this is a toast message that just popped up. It says, no need, you're already a developer. So you tap on that a bunch of times. So it's the build number. I've had that enabled forever, so I didn't remember exactly which one. And then, so once that happens, you get this developer options down here in the bottom left. Clicking on that, and then scrolling down somewhere to the bottom. I don't know exactly where it is. Maybe I passed it. Okay, yeah, it's at the bottom. Apps don't keep activities. so destroy every activity as soon as it leaves it. So let's click that on. Okay, let's see. Yeah, maybe it deleted it and then it just got all unhappy with me. So I'm going to launch this manually. We called it intense, so it'll have... There it is. Okay. Let me just make sure that that setting got saved. Did not. Okay, so that got saved. So switch back to my intense app, and then click on this, and it says you're right, and then I'm going to click the back button. And you didn't notice anything happening, but what we can do is we can go over to Android Studio, go into main activity, and in our let's see here. Oh, this is not our application. I gotta open everything back up. Okay. All right, so what we're going to do is go to our, where do I want to put this? Content main. And in here, I'm going to put a edit text field, so plain text. I'm going to put it right in the center here and expand this to be, oh wait, there we go. Okay, now I'm going to launch this, launch it on Genymotion. Switch over to Genymotion. This will relaunch. Okay, so we have an input text field here, and if I start typing stuff in and then I rotate, and the way they rotate it in Genymotion is just click this little button here. It's kind of a device rotating.
Is there any way to find that if it disappears every time I rotate that?
What's that?
The rotate icon?
Yeah, you can scroll up and down on that, so if I rotate that again, it did not actually delete my... or maybe this arrow. Yeah, it's a little tiny arrow here that you can scroll up and down through your stuff. Anyway, so I have that there, and then if I click on one of these buttons and then go back, okay, it did not destroy my activity. Interesting. Okay, I mean that's a good thing, but we won't. I'll figure out how to actually kill the activity so I can show you what happens. But what used to happen in the past, just by doing that, all those numbers would disappear, and then you'd start from scratch. Maybe that's a new SDK thing. That's what I'm hoping, but I'll figure that out after class and then let you know how to actually do that, how to actually break your activity. But yeah, this is great. Let's see. So
The new activity that popped up when you hit the back button, does this one get destroyed?
yes,
Hit back?
yes,
Okay.
yeah.
That's default.
Yep. So let me show you that actually, because that's a great question, which I was going to do before all this reset on me. Okay, I'm going to put a breakpoint by clicking in this gutter here, and a little tiny red item will come up and it'll highlight this line, and I'll put a breakpoint there. So this is on the first line in the onCreate. And then what we can do is, if you remember back from the beginning of the week when we talked about the life cycle of an activity, we have an onPause method that we can override, as well as an onCreate that we can override. So by default they just give you the onCreate, but we can do an onPause as well. And the easiest way to do that is, let's see if I can remember the shortcut keys, Command N, but that's easy to remember. I would have been embarrassed if I forgot that. So Command N or Control N on Windows will bring up this generator, and this is a really cool feature. We can generate a constructor, a getter or setter if we have members. The one I want to do is override methods. And the reason I want to do it this way is because we can see all of the methods we can override in our activity class or whatever subclass we happen to be in. And so this is searchable. So if I just start typing in on, it'll give me all the methods that contain on. Well, that's not too helpful because there's a lot of them that contain on. So I can do on p a u s e, or that comes up there. So it's highlighting the on pause one. That's what I want. I don't remember what the method declaration is for this, but all I have to do is hit enter on that, and it does that for me. So it's protected void. It doesn't have any parameters. That's fine. And then it calls the superclass here. And so I'm also going to do a breakpoint there by clicking in this gutter. And I could turn that off if you're not used to this by clicking it again. And the reason I want to do this is I want to see if this code is being executed. Yeah, I could put out a debug statement as well, but I'll show you how this code is being executed and how to debug in Android Studio. So we click this little bug icon. It's right next to the play button. I do believe it's Control D, and it is. A little pop-up tooltip comes up, so it is Control D. So if you're having breakpoints that are not being stopped at, then it's because you hit the play button and not the debug button. So it's very important. So let's hit the debug button. Our application will start over again. It'll ask us. Yep. Okay, so initially this is no surprise. Our onCreate method gets called and it stops execution on that first line. And then via this toolbar down here, kind of in the middle, we could either step over code, we can step in code. This works just like any other debugger. And so if I step over, I can execute line by line. I can look at, if I want to watch any variables, I can add variables to the watch. I can look at the stack, the call stack here to see who called this method and who called that method and all the method calls, and that's the stack for you. And then also we have variables. So our variables that you're probably interested in is the this class or the this instance, and under that we have a whole bunch of classes that are part of the activity instance that we're not really worried about at this point. But as we go down through the code, let me put another breakpoint here so I can skip over that and then just do a play. This is not the play button here. I always click that for some reason because it's right next to my step over. It's not a continue, it's not a play button to execute the rest of the code. It's actually a show execution point. So if I'm scrolled down here and I click that button, it'll jump me back to which line of code is actually being executed. So I always do that. I always click that button. But this is the actual play button that'll go from this line of code down to the next breakpoint. And the next breakpoint just happens to be a few lines of code down. So I'm just going to hit that. You'll see it jumps to that breakpoint. And now when I step over the CS402 button, I can see that this is not in. So that variable shows up way at the bottom here. I don't know if you can see that in the back, but trust me, it's there. It shows you what type of button it is. It's an app compat, which is compatible with the support library. We won't really talk about that, but you can see there's a long string. It's not just the button class. It's the app compat button, yada yada yada. And then you can expand that window, or not that window, that item to go into that and see what value it has. And if you want, you can actually change the value here. So let's say this was an integer instead. You can change the integer right in that window instead of having to change it in your code and then re-executing it. So it's a really powerful tool to manipulate the execution of your application and maybe debug it, which is kind of the whole point, right? So that's how that works. But let me play through that. I'm going to remove that top. No, actually I'm going to remove this one. And then hit play again. And it should just go as normal. And we have one in the on pause. And then let me go to my details activity and also put one in the on create here. And so when I click on one of these buttons, you can see now it is in my main activity. Let me go to present. Oh, no, I'll stay here. So you can see what class it's on right now by the highlighted section here and the tab. It's the main activity. So the main activity is being paused. So any execution on it via the UI is going to be paused. So I'm going to play through that. So this might be, in the on pause, you might put logic in there to maybe shut something off or turn off a sound or whatever to handle the fact that it's going to sleep or to pause. And now our second breakpoint after you hit the play button or the continue button is now being executed in the onCreate in our details activity. So our details activity is still being shown, and if I go over to our Genymotion app, you can essentially see it's just black right now, and as I execute the code it'll continue. So I'm just going to hit play through that, switch back over to Genymotion. Now this is our details view. I don't have it on pause in here, so when I just pop this off the stack by hitting the back button, it goes away, but my onCreate actually does get executed. So again, so it is being destroyed. I do not know why it's being recovered. Maybe that's a new feature of the new SDK. Things always change on me. Every time I teach this class, I always have these assumptions about how things work, and they change it. So this is great if this is what I expected, if this is what I think it is, and maybe we don't have to worry about it, which is awesome. But I'll figure that out later. I'll go back through the documentation and see if that's actually a thing that we need to worry about anymore. So again, this is being destroyed, but it's also being called onCreate again. And if we step over that, yeah, it's just going to execute all this as normal. So it's going to set up your button listers, all that fun stuff again. So that's just how that works. Got all these windows open now. Background. Okay. Any questions on intents so far? Now I gotta find my I have to restore that. Okay. Boy. I'll just log in here. Yeah, I lost all my tabs. I have to restart that, but I got a million things open. Yeah, that was funny. Okay, so where we left off was our demo here. Okay, so launching a new activity. That's how you do it. Now we're going to show you how to pass information to our child activity. So the way that we do that is there's a method called putExtra, and this is a kind of a, well, we'll go into details more, but this is very similar to our bundle put string, put int, put float, that kind of thing we talked about last class. And the first parameter that it accepts is a key. So we have a key, let's say, we can say whether the answer was true or it was incorrect. So we might want to pass in a Boolean value and say for the first parameter is correct, and then our value, the second parameter, can be false or it could be true depending upon obviously what the answer is, what the correct answer is. And so those are just definitions of those two parameters, and we can accept any primitive type and serializable type. So if you have a serializable class, you can implement a serializable interface on that class and then use that in the put method. So what does this look like? This is in the child activity, so this is the second activity that we're creating. In its onCreate, this is how to get this from the parent. So we're declaring, in this case we're using a string. We're saying string, and I'm just calling it string extra, kind of like extra information that's being passed along. And then we call this method called getIntent. This is a method on the activity class that it knows about. It knows what intent launched it. So it has a reference to that intent. And in that intent, we can get all the string extras by giving it that key that we originally passed in. So the key here, this name constant in this first parameter that we use to put the information in that, let me draw you a picture real quick. It's basically the picture from the first slide there with all the documents here, or the screenshots. But so we have two activities. This will be the child activity, this will be the parent activity, and then we have an intent in the middle. And with the name constant, I'm just going to call it NC. Do I have any? Yeah, so this is just a string. So I'm just going to say the name constant, whatever that is, equals true as a string, okay, with an exclamation point. And so the parent's passing this information, and then the child is going to receive it, okay? So it's going to grab this, receive it here. Yeah, that's good. So, and then it pulls it out in here, okay? So that's one example. And then if we have a Boolean, we can do, let's say, is underscore correct as our name constant, and they're all uppercase because they're constants, at least I like to do it, equals true, okay? And then that information comes from the parent, and then it comes in the child, okay? So I'll show you this how in code. And if there's no other reason to come to class, you can see my awesome drawing that I do on the board. So how to receive that information, or how to actually get that information back to the child in the parent activity is we have to first, instead of doing a start activity like I showed you, we call a start activity for result. And this is going to essentially expect a result back when we launch that secondary activity. So start activity for result, or just start activity if you don't need a result back. This is in the child activity, and this is all referenced, but I'll put in the example code. So we have a return intent. Again, this is in the child. So the child is going to have another intent that goes this way. So when I hit that back button, or I hit an OK button, or I hit one of questions in there, or whatever, you want to pass information back to the parent. This is how you do it. So again, you create a new intent, but you can notice that this intent constructor is blank. But on the intent, we put an extra, again, name constant, whatever variable you want to put in there, and then we set result. And the first one is a constant. I think that just equals 1. That result OK, I think equals 1, or it could equal 2. I don't even know. But you don't really care. It's a constant, and you're giving that intent, and that intent bundles up all these different values. And then we call finish to actually kill the child activity programmatically without hitting the back button. And then finally, back in our parent activity, we have this callback method called onActivityResult. And we got a few parameters passed in, and we can check whether the data is null, and if it is, return. But if not, then we can actually pull the data, or in this case, it's our intent bundle. We can pull that string out, and again, we're just calling it name constant. Okay? So with the 10 minutes that we have left in class, I will see if I can throw this together for you. So what I'm going to do, because we have 2 buttons here, is I'm going to pass in, or I'm going to, instead of start activity, I'm going to do start activity for result, and accepts a few things here. You pass it the intent, and then you give it a flag. This number is kind of a way of telling the child activity what, kind of like an ID. Let's see what the documentation says on this one. Yeah, it's a request code, so that when it comes back, I'll show you this later. Let's keep 0 in there for now. But this request code, this parameter that comes in here on the activity result, so this is our callback in our parent. That's the request code that comes back. So most of the time you put 0, but if you have multiple activities being launched and you want to know what child activity is coming back, this is a great way of knowing that. It's just the request code. And then you have the result code, which is this guy being passed back. So I'll try to show you that in the next 10 minutes. So I'm just going to do that. I'm going to remove this breakpoint. And that's all we have to do in order to just expect a result back but we're not passing any information to the child yet, so let's go ahead and do that. And the way that we do that is in the intent. We're package that information in the intent, so intent, and then I'm going to put Boolean. Let's see what put extra, and then it accepts a Boolean. Let's see, so I'm going to call this is correct, and I'm going to pass in the value of true. And let me do this for both because I don't want to pull out some stuff is correct. No offense to my 402 class, but the answer for that is going to be false. And for this one, we just do override this for results and the request code or the ID of the activity that's going to come back. So if you have multiple start activity for results, you can put in a number there. Okay, so that's all we have to do to pass information to our child activity. Your imagination can run wild here what you can actually send over there. Now in our onCreate, we have the intent, so let's get a reference to that. Well, no, I'll just pull out the Boolean. So I have a Boolean value, this is correct, equals get intent dot get extra, Boolean extra in this case. Okay, and then we pass back the string that we give it the string that we're expecting. I don't remember what I called it, is correct. This is a terrible way to do constants. This is if I misspell this word, for example, it won't work in my secondary application. So a really cool way is if you right-click on this, if you highlight it, right-click on it, you can go down to the refactor and go to, where is it? Extract, and then extract to a constant. Here it is. Or the shortcut Option Command C. And what this will do is it'll ask me, okay, which one do I want? Yes, public static final. Perfect. Hit enter. And now it's a constant, it's a variable. It's a final, well, you don't have constants in Java, but it's essentially a constant, right? It's a static final string that we have here. And to access that, so instead of typing in the string manually and potentially misspelling it, we can call main activity dot is correct. And so again, it's a class member. Well, it's a static member, but it's a class member that we can access this way. So this is a really nice way of not having to remember what you called these keys. But that was important for me to cover for you guys, because let me close all this stuff. What's this expecting? Oh, I forgot the default value. So if nothing comes back from the bundle, it's expecting a default value. So I'm just going to put in false for that one. And then I'm going to put a breakpoint on that. And then, let's see. Okay, and then to pass back information, we'll do set result, and then if you don't need to pass in information, that's fine. So I'm going to do result OK. Let me type this in a little bit more so you can. So the options we have is result canceled. So maybe something popped up asking them a question, they hit canceled. So there's a constant for that. There's a constant for result OK, so maybe they hit OK. And it's really up to you what you do with this. This is not defined. This doesn't define your logic at all. But if I did result OK, and then I wanted to check what that was, this is just an easy way to see what the result code was. So I'm going to do that callback, which is, if you remember from the notes here, so we're on step 3 on activity result. I'm just going, I don't remember what that I mean, you can copy and paste it from the notes here. I don't remember what the declaration is, so I'm going to go down to override methods and just type in, maybe I forget the first word is on, so I'm just going to tag activity results. And so here it is, activity result, hit enter, here it is, and I'm going to put breakpoint there. I'll finish this up after class to polish it up a little bit. but let's run our debug in the last couple minutes we have. Okay, yeah, so that gets created, no big deal. Hit the play button. And I think this is running, right? So hit the play button, hit this button. Okay, I'm just gonna go through that. Okay, so here's where it's going to pull that information out of the intent that was used to launch this child activity. And I'm gonna step over this, and I can hover my mouse over that variable and see that the variable is false. Now I forget what button I clicked on. I think it was the first. Yes, it was the first one. If you remember, CS402 is apparently not the best class, sorry, in that result there. Switch back to my code, click on the execute there. And so now I can hit, I'm going to send back the result OK. But you're going to notice that nothing's going to happen. It's still on my parent or my child activity, so that's fine. I'm just going to hit the back button. And when I hit the back button, you can see now there's an on activity result being called. So this was never called before, but because we called start activity for result, when we do hit that back button, it returns to this parent activity. We get this callback, and we can inspect the request code. So the request code is 0, which is equivalent to the result. OK, constant. No, I'm sorry. The result code, the request code is 0. The result code is -1, which is the result OK. I don't know why it's -1. That's just the way it is. And then our data doesn't actually contain anything because we didn't pass it. We didn't pass anything back. But we have a second here, so let me do that. So we're gonna do intent, return intent, usually what I like to call it, equals new, and it's just a blank intent constructor. And import that, please. And then in this return intent, we can put extra string, and I'm just going to call this some string, and my string I created here. Okay, result OK. What I want to do is I'm going to actually call finish. I want to show you what this does. Call finish. But I'm doing this in my onCreate. I'm not even sure this will work. But once this is created, it'll actually kill the activity. But it'll set the result before doing that. So let's see if this works. I might have to do it as a button press, but I don't have time for that. So I'm going to do this. I'm just going to inspect that. Hit the debug button. Okay, so now I'm going to hit 517. Okay, step over that by hitting this down arrow and inspecting it by hovering it over, and it's true, so that's the expected result. And I can also inspect the variable down here. It says is correct variable true, so you can expect it there. Now we're going to create our intent to return information back to our parent, put extras, some string, this is the string I created, set the result to OK, which if I hover over that, you can see the OK result OK constant equals -1. Again, I don't know why it's -1. You'd think cancels -1, but it doesn't really matter what it is, right? Because it's a constant. And we're going to hit play, and it did indeed kill it. So let's see if everything looks okay. So our result code is 0. That's fine because this is where that comes in. That's the 0. That 0 that I have highlighted here, that's what comes back in there. So if you have, again, multiple activities that are passed back. And then our result code comes back as -1. So we can, if we wanted to, we can say if result code equals result OK, do something. Okay, so that's where you would use it, or you can do else if result code equals result cancel or canceled. Okay, so that's maybe why you'd want to use that. And if we inspect our data, you can see, oh, that's null for some reason. Oh, did I pass in the, set result. Okay, when I did that, I didn't actually pass the intent. I created the intent, I didn't do anything with it. So if you go back to the notes, we were supposed to, in that result, okay, we were supposed to pass the intent somewhere. It didn't go anywhere. Sorry about that. And what do we call it? Return intent? Okay, yeah. I always forget to do the simple things like that. All right, Command D, or Control D, excuse me. I think it's Control D on Windows 2. I'm going to run through this really quickly. You guys can start packing up. I'm sorry to keep you extra, but a little bit of technical difficulties. CS517. Step over that. It is true. Great. Hit the play button to continue there. Now if we look at the data, it is populated with something, and we can go ahead and once this tooltip pops up, if you carefully mouse over it, you can hit this, carefully mouse over it. It disappears if you're not careful. Of course, you can look in the thing here. I like to do it here, though. And here's all your extras and everything like that. This is really, really hard to inspect directly this way. I don't know why. It's just the debugger. Like, I have to go through a whole bunch of different items in here, and I don't even know where it is. But to get that data out, first you would test for null. If data equals null, return. And we could do else. Data get extra, or wait, it's get string. Get string extra? Can never, they're always different. Get string extra. Yeah, I don't know why I didn't tell them. Okay. Get string extra, and then the constant name, I just called it some string. But I think I can't remember what I called it, so I think this is right. This is why I want to do constants. Just make sure. Yeah, some string. There it is. And that's how you do it. You'd set it to, oops. Something like that. And then you can do something with it. Okay, so again, sorry to keep you after, but that was kind of important. I will clean this up a little bit to just make it a little bit more pretty. Things I was supposed to do before the technical difficulty. But this is how you do intense. I do want to say that homework 2, well, homework 1 is due tonight, end of the day, and homework 2 is due January 28th. That is next week, next Thursday. So take a look at that. It's been posted forever. I will talk about it on Tuesday. And project 1 is actually coming up here in a couple weeks. But don't worry, we'll talk about everything you need to know for project 1. But do take a look at project 1 so you have an understanding of how that works, what you need to do for it, and then come with questions. We'll talk about next class.
So doesn't project homework 2 have to do with selection of an idea from homework 1?
Yes.
Do we need your feedback before we do that?
No. Nope. It's a good question. No, you're going to narrow it down for homework 2 and develop your app ideas based on what you want to do. I'll try to do it this weekend, but
No, that's fine.
yeah. No, it's not an absolute necessity. If you really want feedback, like, hey, I'm struggling and I need something, absolutely. I mean, that's always the
I
case.
just don't want to pick something too easy and you go, no, that's not going to be okay.